Hello. Today we are going to discuss Charles Darwin's philosophy of evolution. We are discussing as part of the positivist school because it is by basing some empirical evidence, empirical research, Charles Darwin makes some pertinent conclusions about the theory of evolution. Let us now try and understand something about his life, which will enable us to appreciate the contribution that he has made to this understanding of evolution. Darwin defined evolution as descent with modification. What does this descent with modification mean? It is an idea that the species change over time and it gives rise to new species and they share a common ancestor. So because they share a common ancestor, they are descendant of the same ancestor. But because they evolve into different species, there is a modification. So therefore, it is descent with modification. The mechanism to explain this theory of evolution, which Darwin proposed, is called the natural selection. Resources are limited. Therefore, organisms, they have certain heritable traits. These heritable traits favor their survival and the reproduction will tend to leave more offspring than the peers. And this causes the traits to increase in frequency over generations. The basic idea of biological evolution is that populations and species of organisms change over time. Today, when we think of evolution, obviously, it is Charles Darwin name that comes to our mind. But he was not the first one to propose this idea of evolution. Already in the 18th century or in the early 19th century, we have the French naturalist by name Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. His last name is spelled Lamarck. He published a book proposing that evolution took place. Of course, he failed to propose a mechanism to explain this evolution, which of course Darwin has given us, the mechanism called the principle of natural selection. So Darwin wrote in 1850s one of the most influential book, which has a lot of implications not only for biology in terms of evolution, but also for many of the questions in philosophy. And the book is titled The Origin of Species. When you have time, I would recommend that you could at least browse through the initial pages of that book. That will give us an understanding about how he develops his idea by using the positivist philosophy. Now, what is a species? A species is a group of similar organisms, and they can interbreed with each other to make healthy, fertile offspring. For instance, human beings, we belong to the same species that is called the Homo sapiens. So in this book, Darwin proposed that species evolve. The word he used obviously is descent with modification, which later came to be known as evolution. According to this idea, all living things can trace their descent to a common ancestor, of course, but they get modified over a period of time for the need to survive, to get adapted to the new environment. The mechanism that Darwin suggested, as I told you already, is the principle of natural selection. Now, Darwin explains here that there are heritable traits that help organisms survive and reproduce more common in population over time. Now, what is a heritable trait? A heritable trait is that which is passed on from the parents to children by way of genes. Remember, at the time of Darwin, we didn't have the idea of genes or DNA, which is commonly known today. So you could replace the idea of heritable traits in terms of today's understanding of genetic reproduction, a passing of the DNA from the parents to children. How did Darwin come to this idea of evolution? Darwin did not sit and reflect. All on a sudden, he did not come up with this idea. It was precisely the voyage that he undertook. So he himself explains that it was based on direct observations from the travels that he had undertaken around the globe. In fact, from 1831 to 1836, he was part of a survey expedition that was carried out by the ship HMS Beagle. And this trip included stops in South America, Australia, and southern tip of Africa. At each of the expedition stops, Darwin had the opportunity to study and catalog the local plants and animals, in other words, the different species. Over the course of the travels, Darwin began to see intriguing patterns in the distribution and the feature of organisms. We can see some of the most important patterns Darwin noticed in distribution of organisms by looking at the observations of Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador. Darwin found that nearby islands in the Galapagos had similar but non-identical species of finches living on them. Moreover, he noted that each finch species was well suited for its environment. For instance, species that ate large seeds tended to have large, tough beaks, while those that ate insects had thin, sharp beaks. Finally, Darwin observed that the finches, and that is also applicable to other mammals, found on the Galapagos Islands were similar to the species on the nearby islands of Ecuador, but different from those found elsewhere in the world. Darwin, of course, did not figure all of this out on this trip alone. In fact, he didn't even realize all the finches were related but distinct species until he showed a specimen to a skilled ornithologist, that means a bird biologist, years later. Gradually, however, he came with the idea that could explain the pattern of related but different finches. According to Darwin's idea, this pattern would make sense if the Galapagos Islands had long ago been populated by birds from the neighboring mainland. On each island, the finches might have gradually adapted to local conditions. This process could have led to the formation of one or more distinct species on the island. If this idea was correct, though, why was it correct? What mechanism could explain how each finch population had acquired adaptations or features that made it well suited to its immediate environment? During his voyage and in the years after, Darwin developed and refined a set of ideas that could explain the patterns he had observed during his voyage. In his book on the origin of species, Darwin outlined two key ideas: evolution and natural selection. So we'll spend a few minutes, try and understand what these two interrelated concepts mean. Let us begin with this idea of evolution, which we have already discussed for the most part. As I told you earlier, Darwin proposed that species can change over time. New species come from pre-existing species, and all species share a common ancestor. In this model, each species has its own unique set of heritable differences from the common ancestor, which has accumulated gradually over very long periods. Repeated branching events in which new species split off from a common ancestor produce a multi-level tree that links all organisms. Of course, the tree has to be understood here in the metaphorical sense. Darwin referred to this process in which groups of organisms change in their heritable traits over generations as descent with modification. This is the term he used. Today we call it evolution. Now let us come to the idea of natural selection. Darwin did not only propose that organisms evolved. If that had been the beginning and end of history, he would not have become very famous. But he proposed a mechanism for evolution, and that is where we find the difference between Lamarck and Darwin. Though both of them proposed it, and Lamarck proposed much earlier than Darwin, still Darwin became more famous precisely because of the mechanism that he proposed. And this mechanism is not only elegant but also logical. It explained how populations could evolve, how populations could undergo descent with modification in such a way that they become suited to their environment over time. Darwin's concept of natural selection was based on several key observations. As I told you, he was adopting the positivist method. The first one is traits are often heritable. In living organisms, many characteristics are inherited or passed from parent to offspring. Darwin, of course, knew this was the case, even though he did not know traits were inherited through genes. That was a study which came much later. Secondly, more offspring are produced than can survive. Organisms are capable of producing more offspring than the environment can support. Thus, there is a competition for limited resources in each generation. Thirdly, offspring vary in their heritable traits. The offspring in any generation will be slightly different from one another in their traits. These traits include color, size, shape, etc. And many of these features will be heritable. Now, these are the three major observations Darwin made. And based on these major observations, he concluded the following. Firstly, in a population, some individuals will have inherited traits that will help them survive and reproduce given the conditions of the environment, such as the predators and food sources available. The individuals with the helpful traits will leave more offspring in the next generation than other species, than their peers, since the trait makes them more effective at surviving and reproducing. Secondly, because of these helpful traits which are heritable, and because organisms with these traits leave more offspring, the traits will tend to become more common. In other words, it is present in a larger fraction of the population in the next generation. Thirdly, over generations, the population will become adapted to its environment. This is because individuals with traits helpful in that environment have consistently greater reproductive success than their peers. So these are some of the conclusions he arrived at. I have only discussed with you some of the major points based on his work on the origin of species. In another video, I will try and point out some of the major implications of his theory of evolution and the mechanism natural selection, what it means for philosophy in different questions that we discuss in philosophy. Thank you very much.